an interfaith, diverse, social justice and solidarity nonprofit. We're dedicated to Palestinian liberation and human rights and have been doing this work in various forms under different names since 2006. We're based in Durham, but we have members throughout the Carolinas. We conduct community education events, congregational workshops, retreats, advocate for a just peace in Palestine, Israel with our state and national representatives in the media. And we partner with progressive organizations working intersectionally for collective liberation. Please visit and like us on our Facebook page, and we gratefully accept your financial contributions to help keep these webinars free. Before we get started with an introduction of Josh, I'd like to invite Burhan Ganayem, who's the chair of our board, to bring us words of welcome from our organization, Voices for Justice in Palestine. Burhan.
Burhan, you're muted.
Now
we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yes. I wanted to thank every one of you for joining us tonight, and I wanted to thank Josh, my friend, for really taking the time and joining us tonight to share his recent work or ongoing almost work on this subject. We really appreciate it. I have known Josh for a long time, and he's dedicated to the cause of peace with justice. I wanted to thank all of you guys here. I know most of the people who are on this call, and I appreciate your presence. I wanted you also to thank Mark and Kate for really planning this series and the Zoom arrangement. Kate is doing great work with Mark. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Josh. And I appreciate every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Burhan. Let me introduce you to Josh Ruebner. Many of you may know Josh from long contacts as an activist and an author, but let me just introduce him formally to you. Josh Ruebner is Policy Director at the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project and an adjunct professor in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University. Josh has been enrolled in the PhD program in the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in Great Britain, and Josh has completed his dissertation, only one or two final steps. He's entitled it A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions, United States Policy Toward the Palestinian Nakba, 1947 to 1949. The esteemed Israeli exiled historian Ilan Pappé has been Josh's advisor. What a great opportunity for both of them. Josh is also the author of Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and his book, Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. Josh, it's a great privilege to have you with us tonight. And I wanted to open with just a general question. Many of us remember your previous visits to the Triangle when you were working with the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Those of us at the Church of Reconciliation remember your support for us, as we were one of the cities across the country putting up bus ads. That was a wonderful campaign of the U.S. campaign in 2012. You've dedicated decades of your life to these issues as an activist, an author, and an academic. Could you tell us how you came to be passionately involved in Palestine solidarity work? Maybe talk a little bit about your personal journey with these issues. And again, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you so much to Voices for Justice in Palestine for having me here today. Thank you to all of you who are joining in this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity. For me, the issue of justice for the Palestinian people has always been one that's very, very personal. My father, who passed away earlier this year, was actually born in Palestine when it was still under the British mandate. And the events that I describe in my dissertation, which I'll share with you in a few moments, were events that he lived through as a young child. And so I have that personal connection to the issue. And for as long as I've been politically aware, it's deeply grieved me to see Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, to come to understand the apartheid nature of Israel's rule over the Palestinian people, to come to understand the meaning of the Nakba, the catastrophe, the national dispossession that Israel inflicted on the Palestinian people in 1948. And the reason why I think all of us, especially those of us in the United States, need to work to ensure justice and peace because of our deep, deep complicity, especially today in terms of Israel's ongoing Nakba against the Palestinian people. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm glad to chat more about my personal background in the questions, but I told Mark I hate talking about myself. I much prefer to talk about my research. I think you're muted.
Mark, you're muted.
You'd think I'd know by now, so here we go. That's a great segue to what we're now transitioning to. You've entitled your talk tonight, From Truman to Biden, U.S. Policy Toward the Ongoing Palestinian Nakba. It's a great opportunity for us to learn some of the central insights you've gleaned from all of your research. Could you give us kind of a guided tour into that topic and what stands out for you? We're all ears.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. What I'd like to do is cover 4 main points in my remarks tonight. I want to talk to you about what I learned doing this research in terms of what the United States predicted would be the results of partitioning Palestine. Number 2, I want to talk to you about some of what the United States knew about the Nakba as it unfolded in real time. Number 3, I want to talk to you a little bit about how the US related to what it knew about the Nakba and what positions it took. And then finally, I want to talk to you about the US policy goals that were articulated and whether those were met or not. And then lastly, I want to try to do some comparing and contrasting between the original Nakba today and the horrors that we're seeing unfold today. So let's start with what the United States knew or predicted would happen should the United Nations partition Palestine into 2 states. What the United States understood was that the idea of partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state was not anything that could be counted as being based upon a principle. In fact, US diplomats talked about how the only reason why the United States supported the idea of partitioning Palestine was out of expediency. But it was more than that. It wasn't just that the US couldn't articulate a principle for partitioning Palestine, but the actual reverse was true. So State Department officials warned time and time again that the idea of partitioning Palestine against the wishes of its majority indigenous Palestinian inhabitants constituted a violation of Palestinian self-determination. And such a partition could not be imposed upon the Palestinian people unless they agreed to it. And if they didn't agree to this partition, it could only be imposed upon them by force and would have to be sustained by force. This is very clear from the documentary record that I examined. Let me give you one example of something that I found. In September of 1947, members of the State Department and members of the US delegation to the UN met together to discuss the idea of partitioning Palestine. This was 2 months before the UN actually voted to do so. Warren Austin, who was the US ambassador to the UN at the time, argued that the majority plan, in other words, to partition Palestine into 2 states, actually contradicted the fundamentals of US foreign policy. In the post-World War II era, that meant the principles behind the Atlantic Charter, meaning government can only be by the consent of the governed, and there would be self-determination for all, and no territorial adjustments were to be made without the consent of those concerned with that territory. So Austin saw the idea of partitioning Palestine as a contradiction of fundamentals of US post-World War II foreign policy. This is what was said in summary of his views at this meeting, quote, "In line with the US stated principle of backing the United Nations by defending political independence and integrity, Ambassador Austin did not see how it was possible to carve out of an area already too small for a state, a still smaller state. He thought it was certain that such a state would have to defend itself with bayonets forever until extinguished in blood." Similarly, I want to share with you an analysis that was provided to the State Department by a person by the name of Dr. Wendell Cleland. Dr. Wendell Cleland, previously, before working for the State Department, was a professor at the American University in Cairo for a quarter century and was an acknowledged expert on socioeconomic conditions in Egypt. At the time, he was the head of the State Department's Division of Research for the Near East and North Africa. In this same month, September of 1947, he wrote that the majority plan, in other words, the partition plan, was, quote, "doomed to failure since, quote, acceptance on the part of both groups appears to be necessary for the success of the plan." And of course, Palestinian Arabs were virulently opposed to the idea of partitioning their country. If Palestinians refused to cooperate with this majority plan, then there was a question that arose, which Cleland asked: who will govern the Arab state? Would the mandatory power and whatever other powers are assisting it be obliged to continue to rule the Arabs indefinitely by a military occupation, coercing the area's population to try to make them conform? So Cleland noted that the majority plan for partitioning Palestine was based on the idea that you needed, quote, goodwill and the spirit of cooperation between the Zionist movement and the Palestinian Arabs. It is doubtful, Cleland wrote, if there will be any such spirit developed as a result of the adoption of this plan, the partition plan. So US diplomats argued that partitioning Palestine against the wishes of its majority indigenous inhabitants was a violation of their self-determination, that this could only take place with their consent, that it could not be imposed upon the Palestinian people by force of arms, and that if the Zionist movement chose to go forward with this path without the consent of the Palestinian Arabs, that such a state could only be maintained through the force of arms. And this is why in March of 1948, the United States actually reversed its position. It ended its support for the idea of partitioning Palestine because it recognized that there could be no peaceful and collaborative partition of the land. So instead, from March 1948, all the way up until the very last day of the British mandate over Palestine, May 14th, 1948, the US supported instead an international trusteeship for Palestine, tried to arrange a truce to stop the fighting and the bloodletting, and tried to promote mediation between the sides to figure out alternatives to partition. Of course, this is not what happens. As we know, Israel announced its establishment right at the end of the British mandate. And of course, we also know that the United States immediately provided de facto recognition of this new state for domestic and geopolitical reasons that we can talk about later on if you want. But what I think is more interesting to talk about is what the United States knew about the Nakba, the catastrophe that first Zionist militias and later the Israeli military and government inflicted on the indigenous Palestinian people. In my research, I was flabbergasted. I was astounded by the number of reports I found in the United States archives that showed quite clearly that the United States recognized that Israel was engaged in a wholesale expulsion of the indigenous Palestinian people. The United States documented how Israel was systematically looting the property of Palestinians, including many Palestinian Americans, by the way. The US reported on how Israel was expropriating illegally the property of Palestinians and giving it to new Jewish immigrants. And the United States also sent many, many reports back to the State Department from its diplomats documenting the very harsh, the very pervasive discrimination that faced Palestinians who were able to remain within Israeli-ruled territories. Now, Mark mentioned the title of my dissertation. And the reason why I chose that title is because it comes from a cable from a person named James McDonald. James McDonald was the first US ambassador to Israel. And by no stretch of the imagination could James McDonald be considered a friend of the Palestinian people. In fact, just the reverse is true. James McDonald was an extremely committed Christian Zionist who coordinated activities very closely with the Jewish Agency in the United States to promote Zionist goals. This is what he wrote in October of 1948, so about 6 months or so after Israel's establishment. He wrote, quote, "The Arab refugee tragedy is rapidly reaching catastrophic proportions and should be treated as a disaster." So not only was McDonald an ardent Zionist, but he also knew what he was talking about when it came to the issue of refugees, because James McDonald was also the former High Commissioner for Refugees from Germany for the League of Nations in the 1930s. And he was also the former chair of FDR's Presidential Advisory Committee on Palestinian Refugees. So when McDonald spoke of the crisis of the Palestinian refugees, he spoke not in a hyperbolic way, but in terms that he said were, quote, realistically descriptive and are written out of 15 years of personal contact with refugee problems. McDonald wrote in the fall of 1948 that with the cold and the rain, and actually there was a ton of snow in Palestine in the winter of 1948 as well into 1949. With the approaching winter, the cold weather will, quote, kill more than 100,000 old men, women, and children who are shelterless and have little or no food. McDonald said that what was needed was a, quote, comprehensive program and immediate action that dramatic and overwhelming calamities, such as a vast flood or earthquake, would invoke. McDonald wrote that nothing less will avert horrifying losses. Every consideration of mercy, justice, and expediency call for this radical change at the earliest moment. So the reason why I entitled my dissertation A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions is to recognize that even an ardent Zionist like James McDonald understood that this was a catastrophic situation facing the Palestinian people, and of course uses the English term that Palestinians use to describe their experience as Nakba. So number two, that was what the US actually knew about the Nakba as it unfolded. Let's talk about how the United States actually felt about what was happening. It's a little known fact that the United States, far from actually giving Israel the weapons that it needed to perpetrate the Nakba against the Palestinian people, actually imposed an arms embargo on Palestine in December of 1947 to prevent additional bloodshed. And the United States maintained a very, very firm embargo on all parties, both Israel and the Arab states, through 1949. And when the United States finally lifted the embargo, it was actually Israel that didn't want the embargo lifted because they were getting their weapons clandestinely, and we can talk about that. So the United States imposed an arms embargo to try to prevent the conflagration of violence. The Truman administration helped pass no less than 10 different resolutions throughout 1948 in the United Nations Security Council, either calling for a truce, for a mandatory ceasefire, or for an armistice. And of course, also in December of 1948, the United States worked with other countries to shepherd through the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194. Today, that resolution is primarily known for establishing the right of return for Palestinian refugees who want to live at peace with their neighbors. Also, what the UN General Assembly Resolution 194 did was set up a mechanism to try to remedy the injustices of the Nakba, to try to resolve all of the outstanding issues that arose as the active intrastate fighting started to draw to a close between Israel and Arab states, and try to resolve all the political issues. So there were three main political issues that were attempted to be resolved by this new international body that was created through this UN resolution, which is called the Palestine Conciliation Commission. The three main issues were the status of Palestinian refugees, the final borders between Israel and Arab states, and then third, the status of Jerusalem, which of course was supposed to be internationalized under the partition resolution. Now, I'm going to call this the PCC for short, the Palestine Conciliation Commission. The PCC was a UN body that was composed of 3 UN member states. The United States, France, and Turkey was the third. The United States was seen as the main driver of this Palestine Conciliation Commission. And while there were many different US commissioners over the life of the PCC, the most important one is a fellow by the name of Mark Etheridge, who I was telling Mark before we started actually has a connection to the Triangle area because I found that his personal papers are deposited at the University of North Carolina, which I examined for this dissertation. And I want to quote to you from some of these letters that I found from his personal correspondence to his wife, Willie, who herself was a very famous writer. So Mark Etheridge, as part of his initial meetings for the PCC, met with the Israeli Foreign Minister, Moshe Shertak. And he was referring to the events of the previous year. This was in February of 1949, referring back to the events of 1948. And he informed his wife that, quote, during the fighting, the Jews ran about 76,000 Arabs out of Jaffa, the Arab city which adjoins Tel Aviv, and have taken it over. Etheridge noted to his wife that, quote, both sides play roughly in this part of the world, but I am afraid the Jews have learned too much in terrorism from the masters who taught it to them, Germany, Poland, and Russia. We get the most distressing word of systematic destruction of Arab homes. About 600 to 700,000 Arabs are refugees. We're supposed to solve the problem and we're working on it, he told his wife. However, the Israeli foreign minister, Etheridge noted, quote, is determined that they, the Palestinian refugees, they shall not come back. In fact, he wants a homogeneous state with no minority of Arabs. I could have pointed out to him, but restrained myself, that he talked about the Arabs in exactly the same way we heard Hitler talk about the Jews, and that his method of dealing with the Arab question was patterned pretty much after Hitler's. A week later, Etheridge went to visit some of these Palestinian refugee camps for the first time to get a firsthand understanding of the magnitude of the problem. And what Etheridge saw in the Palestinian refugee camps, especially around Jericho, really hardened his feelings against what Israel had done to the Palestinian people. This is what Etheridge wrote to his wife on February 14th, 1949. Quote, "All around Jericho are refugee camps, one of which we visited. I've never seen so many horrible things in one day in my life. Huge families live in one tent, but great numbers have not even a tent and live in the open. There are somewhere between 600 and 700,000 Arabs who have been driven out of Israel or who have left in terror. Jericho is one of the great concentration places. He encountered refugees who cursed the Jews, quote, who have certainly laid up a liability for themselves in a way they have treated these people. And what Etheridge saw when he visited these Palestinian refugee camps near Jericho triggered in him an understanding of the similarities between the settler colonialism that Israel had inflicted on the Palestinian people and the settler colonial erasure of indigenous people in North America. Etheridge wrote, quote, "I don't know any better parallel than the way we treated the American Indians. The disheartening thing is that I have not yet heard one Jewish official who seemed to have any sympathy or who saw in it any parallel of persecution to what Hitler did to them. I've tried to make it plain to them that I have no sympathy with their attitude and that it is one thing they must do something about or answer to the conscience of the world." Etheridge didn't confine these thoughts just in private letters to his wife. He also shared these same experiences with President Truman, who was a personal friend of his. And this prompted Truman himself to write in April 1949 that he was, quote, rather disgusted with the manner in which the Jews are approaching the refugee problem. So what can we take away from this documentation of what the United States knew about the Nakba as it unfolded, and this attitude of empathy that the United States demonstrated toward the plight of the Palestinian people who were made refugees? Number one, the United States did not countenance it. The United States never agreed to Israel's territorial expansionism. The United States never, ever supported Israel driving Palestinians out of their home. These are all things that might be shocking to those of us who look at the policy that we have toward Israel and the Palestinian people today and see only lockstep support for everything that Israel does, which is definitely true. But this is definitely not how it was more than 75 years ago. And so this brings me to the fourth point I'd like to raise with you tonight is, what did the United States do with this information, and how did it try to remedy the injustices of the Nakba that it documented, that it saw, that it understood, and that it wanted to try to rectify? So going back to the Palestine Conciliation Commission for just a moment, I mentioned that Jerusalem was an issue, but really there was acquiescence between splitting the city between Jordan and Israel by that point, and it wasn't really a central issue of the negotiations that took place. There were really two major issues. There were the borders of the state of Israel and what would be done about the Palestinian refugee crisis. And the United States understood that these two issues were inextricably linked, and I'll explain that in just a minute. So what were the stated policy goals of the Truman administration when it came to these two crucial issues of determining Israel's border and determining the fate of Palestinian refugees? Let's talk about borders first. In late 1948, the Truman administration enunciated what became known as the Jessup Principle, Jessup. This was named for Philip Jessup, who was a distinguished international legal scholar and a member of the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. He didn't make up the policy, but he articulated it in the United Nations, and that's why his name is associated with this principle. So in a nutshell, what the Jessup Principle said is that if Israel wanted to try to maintain its territorial conquests beyond the partition boundaries that the United Nations had recommended, then Israel would be forced to give up some territory that was designated to it under the UN partition plan. In other words, the United States did not support Israel's territorial expansionism. Most often, the Jessup principle was expressed in the formula of if Israel kept the portion of the Western Galilee that was designated for an independent Arab state, then it should give up part or all of the Nakba, or the Negev Desert, in the south of the country. So that was on the territorial issue. What about the issue of Palestinian refugees? The Truman administration was very, very precise in its mathematical calculations of the Palestinian refugee crisis. And for many, many months, the United States firmly demanded that Israel repatriate, at the minimum, 250,000 Palestinian refugees to their original homes. Now, how did the United States come up with this number of 250,000 Palestinian refugees that Israel must repatriate? They calculated that based on the number of Palestinians who were supposed to be in the so-called Jewish state under the partition plan, which actually had a demographic balance between Jews and Palestinian Arabs. We can talk more about that if you want in questions and answers. So originally, under the partition plan, as passed by the UN, there were supposed to have been 400,000 Palestinians who lived in the Jewish state. So the United States got this number and insisted on Israel's repatriation of 250,000 and added that to the estimated 150,000 Palestinians who remained under Israeli territorial control to get back to that original 400,000. In other words, the United States supported the same amount of Palestinians being under Israeli territorial control as envisioned under the partition plan. In other words, they did not support their permanent expulsion from their homes, but they recognized that some would definitely have to be resettled elsewhere. So the question is, if the United States held these very clear policy positions, which were articulated very clearly to Israel in the PCC, by the way, why was the United States unsuccessful in actually achieving these stated policy goals? And here, the Truman administration policy looks similar to a lot of other US administrations that we can point to. And I would say that the United States failed in achieving these political goals of repatriating 250,000 Palestinian refugees and getting Israel to disgorge some of its territorial aggrandizement that took place in 1948, quite simply because the Truman administration was unable or unwilling to utilize the immense leverage the United States held over Israel at that time. So what did that leverage consist of that the United States had? At that time when negotiations were taking place in 1949 that were supposed to resolve all outstanding political issues and attempt to rectify the injustices of the Nakba, at least partially, Israel had applied for and received a loan from the US Export-Import Bank for $100 million. $100 million about 75 years ago is basically a little bit more than $1 billion today. $1 billion with a B. So this was a significant loan. And mind you, Israel was not an advanced, sophisticated economy at its outset as it is today. It was going through an incredibly difficult time of economic development, of trying to absorb Jewish immigrants who were pouring into the borders. It desperately needed this money for its own development purposes and for its own financial solvency, because it was really on the brink of not being economically viable at all. This export-import bank loan was a lifeline that the Truman administration threw out to Israel, and it represented a significant amount of leverage that we exercised over that country. And in fact, in the summer of 1949, the United States actually decided to freeze disbursements from this Export-Import Bank loan in order to put pressure on Israel to accomplish US policy goals of getting Israel to disgorge some of its territory and getting it to repatriate Palestinian refugees. Unfortunately, where the Truman administration fell short was not actually turning this leverage and this decision to freeze the Export-Import Bank loans into actual sustained pressure on Israel. So it took the State Department actually many, many months to actually communicate to Israel that these loans had been frozen. So for most of the time these negotiations were taking place, Israel didn't even know that the United States took this step to punish it, to try to compel it to change its policies. And then once it was announced, then Truman quickly buckled to pressure that was exerted on him to lift the freeze on the loan, and then the loans started flowing again. This move to restart the loans to Israel coincided with a dramatic turning point in US policy. In the summer of 1949, the United States explicitly decided to give up on a political resolution to the issues left outstanding by the Nakba. And instead, the United States explicitly shifted its focus to an economic approach. This was known as the Economic Survey Mission, and it laid the groundwork for the establishment of UNRWA, the UN agency that has been providing social services to Palestinian refugees for now more than 75 years. This decision not to actually utilize all the leverage that the United States had over Israel at the time, and instead go to this economic approach, precluded the political issues from being resolved. And what the Truman administration did instead was it froze a very unjust status quo. And the freezing of this unjust status quo and the transition from a political to an economic approach is why the Nakba is an outstanding issue today and why it is an ongoing affair. Of course, we know that the Nakba never really ended. And one of the things that surprised me most about the research that I found in the archives was how the United States was documenting Israel's ongoing expulsion of the Palestinian people long after armistice agreements were signed and there was no active fighting between Israel and Arab states. So US diplomats documented in incredible detail how in 1949 and in 1950, Israel expelled Palestinian villagers from Wadi Fukin near Bethlehem. How they expelled Palestinians from the Little Triangle, which was an area that was ceded to it in the Israeli-Jordanian armistice agreement. How they were expelling Palestinians from the prosperous Galilee village of Tarshiha in the north. How in the southern parts of the country, after the armistice agreement was signed between Israel and Egypt, Israel engaged in the wholesale expulsion of Palestinians from the villages of Fallujah and Iraq al-Manshia. How in 1950, Israel deported thousands and thousands of Palestinians from Isdud and Asqalan into the Gaza Strip. And how Israel in 1950 expelled thousands of members of the Azazmeh Bedouin tribe from the Nakab, from the Negev Desert, into the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. These were things that were all extensively documented by the United States and spoke to the United States' knowledge of Israel's ongoing Nakba that it was inflicting against Palestinians. We as historians don't actually really know how many Palestinians Israel killed during the Nakba in 1948. Senator Tom Connolly, who was a Democrat from Texas and also who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said something that spoke to this uncertainty on the floor of Congress in February 1949. He said, quote, "Deaths among the Palestinian refugees from exposure, disease, and starvation are almost impossible to estimate. In many areas, the refugees bury the dead in secret. Both Egyptian and neutral observers estimated in early December that deaths in the Gaza area alone averaged 120 per night. Pneumonia, dysentery, weakness, and malnutrition among the aged account for a large part of this mortality, Tom Connolly said. So the best guesses that historians have, and we'll never know the actual figure, is that between 15 and 20,000 Palestinians were killed either directly through hostilities or indirectly because of starvation, because of exposure to the elements. And as I read all of these reports from the US archives, especially the reports concerning the incredibly precarious situation facing Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip in 1948, in 1949, there were times when it was very hard in my mind to distinguish those reports from the horrific reports that we've seen coming out of the Gaza Strip for now the previous more than 1 year. And just as we don't know how many Palestinians were killed in the original Nakba, we also don't really know how many have been killed in Israel's genocidal violence over the past year. We already know that the death toll of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is at least twice as high as the highest estimate of Palestinians killed in 1948. More than 42,000 deaths have been documented and confirmed by the Palestinian Ministry of Health, and this does not include 10,000 people who are missing under the rubble, presumed dead. Recently, Americans, doctors on medical missions of relief to the Gaza Strip wrote to the Biden administration that they believe that more than 60,000 additional Palestinians have died as the result of starvation over the past year. And estimates in the Lancet indicate that indirect deaths of Palestinians may be as high as nearly 200,000 people already, 1/10 of the population of the Gaza Strip. Like 1948, the Biden administration, like the Truman administration, knows and knew full well of the humanitarian catastrophe that Israel was inflicting and is inflicting on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. A recent report from Reuters from earlier this month showed that only days into Israel's attacks on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the State Department warned of a, quote, humanitarian catastrophe. There's that word again, Nakba. Biden administration officials knew that Israel was inflicting a humanitarian catastrophe on the Palestinian people. And the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor recommended that the United States hold up the shipment of 16 different weapon shipments to Israel because of this humanitarian catastrophe. This Reuters report, which I urge you to read, is a damning indictment of the Biden administration's complicity in Israel's war crimes and the crimes against humanity that are being inflicted right now as we speak. We also know from recent reporting from ProPublica that the Israeli embassy actually rewarded State Department employees who were working nights and who were working weekends at the instruction of senior Biden administration officials to expedite the delivery of weapons to Israel. We know that the Israeli embassy sent bottles of wine to these State Department officials to thank them for all their work in expediting these weapon shipments to Israel. We know also from a ProPublica report that Secretary of State Blinken overturned the advice of experts in the USAID and again in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Those two bodies within the State Department both came to the conclusion that Israel was blocking humanitarian aid to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And according to US law, Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, to be exact, any country that blocks humanitarian aid is ineligible for any form of US assistance. So the US law is clear. And what the State Department was telling the Secretary of State was also quite clear, that Israel was in clear violation of this law. And Secretary of State Blinken, instead of listening to the advice of his experts, sent a fraudulent report to Congress saying that Israel had improved the mechanisms for the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people, and that it was no longer a problem, and that therefore Israel was in compliance with US laws so that weapons could keep flowing. Do you see what he's doing here? He's lying to Congress and he's lying to the American public about Israel breaking US law in order to continue expediting weapons to Israel. So instead of embargoing weapons to Israel, which is what more than 60% of all Americans want to see right now, including, by the way, 77% of all Democrats, instead of embargoing arms to Israel, like the Truman administration did, and as is required under US law and international law, the Biden administration not only has expedited weapons to Israel over the course of the past year, but it's also done so in a way that subverts the ability of Congress to have any oversight of how these weapons are being transferred. In many cases, what the Biden administration is doing is giving these weapons to Israel and breaking them up into little different deals so that they're under the level of the threshold at which they need to be notified to Congress. So Congress is being kept in the dark, which means that we as American citizens are also being kept in the dark. But we do know that since October of 2023, the Biden administration has sent 600 deliveries of weapons to Israel. That's one delivery of weapons approximately every 12 hours. And we know that these 600 deliveries of weapons have amounted to 50,000 tons. 50,000 tons worth of weapons provided to the Israeli military. In that same amount of time, Congress also appropriated an astounding $18 billion in weapons to Israel. And the Biden administration is now trying to deliver $20 billion of weapons to Israel. I think everyone on this call, on this webinar, understands quite clearly that it is US weapons that are killing Palestinians. Of this, there is absolutely no doubt. From the JDAMs, the Joint Direct Attack Munitions, which are supposed to make dumb bombs, so-called SMART, by attaching a GPS guidance system to them. We know that these missiles are being fired on Palestinians who are seeking shelter in schools, in mosques, in tents, in hospitals. We've seen time and again how US weapons have ravaged and devastated and decimated dozens, if not hundreds, of Palestinians internally displaced at one time. We've seen children dismembered. We've seen people incinerated beyond recognition, all the result of US missiles, US fighter jets, US attack helicopter gunships provided by us, US taxpayers, to Israel. Unlike 1948, when we could say that we did not provide one single bullet to Israel to drive Palestinians off of their ancestral land, we can say with certainty that Israel's war crimes are being committed with our taxpayer dollars and with our weapons. And it's not only the weapons, but it's also the diplomatic support that the Biden administration has provided to Israel, which stands in such stark distinction to the Truman administration. So earlier, I mentioned that the Truman administration voted for no less than 10 Security Council resolutions promoting a truce, a ceasefire, or an armistice in 1948. Contrast this with the Biden administration. The Biden administration exercised its veto, its undemocratic veto, in the UN Security Council on 3 separate occasions to block the international community from imposing a ceasefire on all sides and releasing the hostages. 3 times this was vetoed by the United States as we continued to expedite the weapons. And then when the United States finally abstained and allowed a ceasefire resolution to go forward, do you know what the Biden administration did? It made the unique legal argument that a Security Council resolution was not binding. It was not mandatory. This flies in the face of 75 years of international law and international practice. When the Security Council passes a ceasefire resolution in any context of hostility, it is mandatory on all of the parties to that armed conflict to abide by its terms. So, in summary, I leave you with this thought. Although the Truman administration made many, I think, terrible choices, today, 75 years later, the United States is infinitely more complicit in Israel's ongoing Nakba toward the Palestinian people than we were in 1948. And that's something that's very sobering to think about. But I think it's also something that challenges all of us to redouble our efforts to end US complicity in Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Josh, thank you. Wow, that was an amazing, head-spinning, soul-churning romp through all of that history. I want to ask a couple of questions, if I can pull my thoughts together from listening to you, which was really quite transfixing. And then we'll turn it over to the audience for their questions. I was really struck by what you said about the presence of diplomats in the Truman administration and in that period who were filled with compassion and empathy toward the Palestinians, and who were forthrightly advocating for what would, by most accounts, seem to be just and fair and empathetic policy toward the Palestinians, not only in stopping the trying to stop the Nakba, but as you say, trying to find remedies for the Nakba. And then when you said that an unjust status quo became frozen in 1949 and has remained frozen essentially to the present time and only gotten more and more egregious. I guess my question is, what in your mind and from your research accounts for this deterioration from a time when American foreign policy seemed guided by principles of compassion and rationality and care and self-determination of peoples coming from the League of Nations principles. What accounts for the transition from all of that, which you've laid out for us, to this ideologically driven blindness towards Zionism? I mean, that's probably, I don't know, you can isolate all of the factors, but could you speak to what in your mind accounts for the reasons our foreign policy is so removed from where it was? And I don't mean to idealize the Truman years. There were lots of bad decisions, as you said, but there were some really interesting and hopeful and empathetic ways of dealing with Palestinians, which we don't have and haven't had for many, many years. What do you think accounts for that?
That's a
Or
very,
do with that as you wish. That's maybe too big a
yeah.
question, but
Oh, that is a extremely important question. One of the things that I learned through my research was that there was a very active movement in the United States 75 years ago to try to advocate for the rights of the Palestinian people. This was a movement that was composed both of Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans more broadly, but Palestinian Americans in particular, and also non-Palestinian Americans, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And they had institutes at that time, which were called the Institute of Arab American Affairs. There was the Committee for Just Peace in the Holy Land. And, these organizations put together magnificent pamphlets that articulated the case very strongly for why Palestine should not be partitioned, why it should be a secular democratic state with equal rights for all of its inhabitants. And that message resonated very strongly within the Truman administration's State Department. And in fact, one of the major characters of my dissertation is a fellow by the name of Lloyd Henderson, who was the head of the State Department's Near East and Africa division at the time. He actually wrote an incredibly detailed constitutional structure for Palestine that was a secular democratic state based on equality for all. It's an amazing document. It's actually on the internet today. It's part of the Foreign Relations of the United States series, which is what the State Department publishes of its official documents that it thinks are relevant. And I kid you not, you can read this document today and you can dust it off the shelf and you can almost apply it word for word today to help us think beyond the stale two-state paradigm. So where am I going with this thought? In some respects, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because you basically had the same configuration of power 75 years ago that exists today. You had a very determined, very smart, very sophisticated movement that advocated for Palestinian rights in the United States. And you had support for that stance within certain departments of the United States government. But it was overmatched. It was overmatched by the power and the organizational ability of the Zionist movement, which had its own extremely tight connections into the domestic political circles of the Truman administration. So look, this is not an easy question to answer. Truman, I think, primarily was motivated by humanitarian concerns. More than anything else, he wanted to see a resolution to the issue of what were called displaced persons. These were Jewish people who had survived the horrific Nazi genocide and who were in many cases still in some of the same camps in which they were imprisoned under the Germans. The problem was that the United States Congress and the United States public was incredibly xenophobic then, as elements of it are extremely xenophobic today. And they didn't want to take in Jewish displaced persons from Europe. Truman wanted massive immigration into the United States of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, but he wasn't able to get it. So for him, the idea of sending as many Jewish displaced persons to Palestine was primarily a humanitarian issue. I don't think he was ever a political Zionist. I know that there's a lot of historiography out there that would like to portray Truman as this staunch Christian Zionist. I didn't see it in any of the papers I examined. I thought he was deeply, deeply conflicted about the decisions that he made. Time and time again, he went back to a commission from 1946 that was a joint US-UK commission that basically said that Arabs should not dominate Jew and Jews should not dominate Arab in Palestine. And it did not call for the establishment of a Jewish state. And Truman, even the day he recognized Israel, I kid you not, the day he recognized Israel, he wrote a letter to this one very Zionist member of that commission saying, this was a mistake. We should have gone with that recommendation from 1946, not to partition country. So he was very equivocal in his policymaking. He was also, I think, overly influenced by domestic and electoral political considerations that played a vital part in his decision-making in 1948. But he was horrified. He was disgusted with what Israel had done to the Palestinian people. But he wasn't a strong enough of a moral person to actually put his foot down and use his leverage to overturn it.
Thank you, Josh. I have tons of other questions, but I think I'm going to stop and turn it over to the many hands that I see. Kate, do you want to call on the hands that you see, or do you want me to do that? I guess you could unmute them. You want to just start with the ones you see?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. We're gonna start with Laura.
Hi, thanks. Am I unmuted? Yes. Thank you very much for that, Josh. So I guess it's a two-part question about American influence. Like you just finished saying that Truman may have been a good man, but he kind of caved to pressure, and that maybe it was electoral, domestic pressure. But what was that pressure? Like, what was that pressure electorally on behalf of Israel? I mean, who was exercising that pressure? So that's one thing back then. But now I also want to know, in terms of pressure now, you hear the argument framed in two different ways. Mearsheimer's kind of argument about the Israel lobby, and they're the ones sort of pulling wag the tail of the dog or whatever, that they're influencing the policy. And then others say, no, it's that, it's the US that's really, Israel is working until at the behest of the US, and they're probably two stark positions, but I'm just wondering what your position is on that. So it's that two-part question.
Do we want to take a couple at a time, and I can kind of answer them in clusters?
Is that how you would prefer to do it?
Sure, yeah, because I might be able to kind of combine things.
So next we have Ara.
Thank you very much for your words of validation, almost Dr. Ruebner. Looking forward to calling you Dr. Ruebner. My family was ethnically cleansed in February of 1948. So we were from the earlier generation of those impacted by the Nakba. My question, and what's really fascinating is that in what used to be the village of, the neighborhood of Menshia in Jaffa, the Etzel Museum, the Museum of the Irgun Zvailoni, that ethnically cleansed my family, had in their museum, they have exhibits called the Liberation of Jaffa and even the Liberation of Deir Yassin. They call that liberation. So my question for you, and this is very different probably from most questions you'll get tonight, is what is your personal vision of justice for those who were dispossessed from the Nakba, starting in 1947 all the way to the present?
Sure. Okay, should we take one more? I see a lot of hands.
Sorry, hi. Hello, is it me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I was getting a glass of water. Okay, I was hoping I was coming later, but you were talking about Biden and America Black on Facebook, and you have to hurry up and get that book published for me. But Biden, I really believe has dementia. So I'm wondering who, like you said, Truman had an advisor. Who do you think is advising and has the weight of influence with Biden? And do you think Harris will be any better? By the way, I don't know if you saw it yesterday, the UN convened at 3, and the US lady who always vetoes was a little better. And then Israel told everybody to go fuck themselves, basically. So I'm just wondering who's really pulling the strings here. I mean, I know Christian Zionist has 7.5 times more power and money than AIPAC. But is there any one person, like a Kissinger type of a person, that we should be worrying about?
Thanks. Okay, let me start with Laura's question. I'll do past, present, and future in that order. I told you I could combine them. Okay, so who was it, and what kind of pressure was being exerted on Truman? Look, Truman was not expected to win an election in 1948. He was extremely down in the polls to Dewey, the governor of New York. Of course, you all have seen that famous newspaper headline from the Chicago Tribune, Dewey beats Truman. He was expected to lose, right? So he was really in search of every vote that he could get. And just like today, the Electoral College system back in 1948 made it the case that there were only a few states that would determine the outcome of a given presidential election because most states were considered safe for one party or another. So it just so happened that in 1948, a lot of the states that were up for grabs and that were considered the key swing states for the presidential candidates to win were also states that had strong populations of Jewish voters. And that, of course, influenced both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party's strategy of appealing to the Jewish population in support of Zionist goals. Ironically, Truman actually lost New York and was like the only president to win the presidency while losing New York. I can't remember for how many decades that had been the case. So, you know, his domestic political advisors were of two types. Number one, there was a fellow by the name of Clark Clifford, who was his legal counsel. He was a very, very smart, very savvy lawyer from St. Louis, not at all a committed Zionist, but who basically articulated to Truman that this was a winning electoral strategy for him to adopt pro-Zionist positions. Now, that wasn't the case with some of Truman's other domestic advisors, people like David Niles, who was Truman's outreach director to what were called minority communities at the time, including he was his outreach director to the Jewish community. David Niles was a committed, very, very ideologically committed Zionist, and a lot of what he wrote influenced what Clifford sent to Truman. So it was both ideology that was a factor of the pressure, and it was strategic political calculations at play. That being said, there were also external pressures. So Zionist organizations were organizing days of action. You know, there were protests that took place in dozens and dozens of cities at the same time. They were sending a huge amount of mail into the White House. In fact, if you read Truman's memoirs, he talks about putting it all in a pile, all of these letters advocating for Zionism. They say, put them in a pile, and he struck a match and lit the whole thing on fire. Truman tells some very tall tales in his memoirs. That didn't happen, but it just does go to show you how exasperated he got at times from the pressure that he was receiving from external organizations. You know, does the tail wag the dog, or does the dog wag the tail? You know, I don't necessarily think it's an either or proposition. I think there's a little bit of truth to both of them. So it definitely depends on what period of time you're talking about. I think if we're looking at today, we can see that the US policy toward Israel is both geopolitical and strategic in nature, and also obviously the result of domestic political lobbying. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. Honestly, I have different answers depending on how I feel on a given day. To Erica's question, who advises Biden? Look, here's a huge difference between Truman 75 years ago and Biden today. Truman was not a committed ideological Zionist. Joe Biden is. Joe Biden talks about how, as a young child, his father sat him down at the kitchen table one night after dinner and related to him the horrors to which the Jewish people in Europe were exposed. the centuries of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust. And he talks about how that experience instilled in him a belief that the United States has a moral responsibility to support the state of Israel. This is what Biden himself believes and has talked about on many different occasions. He's talked about how you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, and that he's proudly describes himself as a Christian Zionist. So there's a real ideological affinity for Israel that Joe Biden has always carried through in his more than half century of public service. That being said, he's surrounded by advisors who are extremely myopic in their orientation. I have it on good authority that Joe Biden only listens to policy advice from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Brett McGurk on the National Security Council, and Jake Sullivan, also on the National Security Council. These are the only people making decisions. They're not listening to the experts. They're listening to people like Brett McGurk, who can help construct the disastrous Iraq policy that we've had for decades. You know, so he's not being served by getting good advice. He's being served by people who have been part of the problem of US policy in the Middle East. Do I think that a Harris administration would be better? I think it would. I can't see how it would be worse. I can't see how it could be worse than under Biden. In terms of a Democrat, I can see how it could be much worse under a Trump administration. But under a Harris administration, it's hard to see how it would be worse. That doesn't necessarily mean it would be a whole lot better. It's clear that VP Harris approaches the issue with a bit more empathy for the suffering of the Palestinian people than does Joe Biden. She places more emphasis on the rhetoric of the need for freedom and self-determination and dignity and safety for the Palestinian people than does the president. Does that translate? Do those words translate into action? Do they translate into a different policy? Will VP Harris, who says that she's the candidate of the rule of law in her acceptance speech at the DNC in Chicago, will she apply US law when it comes to weapons to Israel? I don't know. It's an open question, but I don't see how it could be worse than Biden. And then finally, I'll go to Arif's question. And I am very deeply sorry for what happened to your family in 1948. And I don't see how there can be justice or peace or reconciliation or coexistence without not only Israel acknowledging the Nakba, but ensuring that Palestinian refugees are allowed to return to their homes and to their lands, and they be restituted in their property, and they receive vast amounts of compensation for all their decades of deprivation, lost income, lost revenues from those properties. The only possible way to heal this issue is by healing the injustices of the Nakba. And that means undoing it to the greatest extent possible, which means allowing for the repatriation of Palestinian refugees and their descendants. I don't see any other way. Okay, let's do another round if we have time.
We should. Okay, first I am going to call on Alan. Alan, if you could unmute, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. What is this? Anyway, it says something here, as long as you can hear me. Yeah, Josh, congratulations on your dissertation. You know, I follow you on social media as you've been going through things and sharing really important stuff. I'm wondering, why is it that 150,000 Palestinians were allowed to, or somehow managed to stay in Israel? Is there one main reason? Are there various other reasons?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, should take a few more.
Sure. Next, I'm going to call on Jerry and Kathy. If y'all would unmute.
Am I now unmuted?
Yes.
Yes.
Um, I heard the name Mark Etheridge, and I wonder, is that Mark F. Etheridge, who was the often on leader in the staff of Courier Journal in Louisville, Kentucky? Okay, so he
Right,
came to
same
North
person.
Carolina on
Oh, okay.
retirement, and
Oh,
so I've spent time with him and his wife.
wow.
So yeah, I was wondering, it just sounds like it's got to be the same one. And his papers start in 31 and go to 81. And yeah,
Yeah,
go
same
to
person. That's
22.
amazing. Wow. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing.
I've got one story about his wife, if you're interested. The two of them it was about 37. They were in Germany, and Hitler, of course, was leading the people in a terrible direction. And she said, I was close enough that if I had picked up a brick, I could have hit him. And I wish every day that I had done that.
Wow.
And she said, I know I would have died, but
Mm,
anyway.
wow. What an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, and should one more? Chris, if you'll unmute.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josh, for that's incredibly detailed information, really helpful. First I've heard of the US's involvement in that period. I've been trying to take notes. I was watching a video month or so back with actually with Elon, I think speaking at possibly UN or something, but he was hitting on that time period where the was it the Peel Commissioners where they were deciding on the partition plan, and I believe that in the context of all of the other surrounding Arab countries, is like getting input from their population to have their states formed after all the after all that was happening. And of course they wanted that for Palestine too, and I believe you may have touched on it, but could you expound on a little more about was the US requesting that there would be like a 5-year period or something for the Palestinian population to get their input on how they would self-determinate? I say, yeah, that was my question. Mm-hmm.
Do we want? Okay, thanks. Let me take Alan's question. Why were 150,000 Palestinians allowed to stay? I see on here that we have a really amazing historian, Shai Haskani, who probably knows a lot more than I do about this. So maybe he wants to weigh in also. But that's really weird. Can you all hear that feedback?
Yes, I can.
Maybe it's Jerry and Kathy need to be muted, maybe.
Good call.
So yeah, I don't know if allowed to stay is the right word. I think if Israel had its way, it would have expelled all Palestinians. So Shai is a historian of 1948, and he's written this amazing book called Dear Palestine, which examines some of these same events from the viewpoint of what's in the archives of the Israeli military censor. So I definitely want to turn the floor over to Shai to add in on this. And you all should read Dear Palestine. It's really an amazing book. So I don't know if I would say allowed to stay. I think there were some cases where Israel was just not able to conduct military operations to drive Palestinians out of particular areas. I think there were some cases like in Akka, for example, where there was such a concentration of Palestinians, both who lived there and people who were internally displaced. And it was so close to different international diplomatic outposts that it just wasn't possible to engage in ethnic cleansing from there. And then, you know, there's the famous case of Nazareth, where there was large Palestinian population, both indigenous to the city and internally displaced. And Ben-Gurion decided not to ethnically cleanse Nazareth because of the city's religious significance and importance to Christianity. So, you know, there's another book that I can think of by the Palestinian historian Adel Mana, called Nakba and Survival, which looks at the fate of Palestinians who were able to stay behind in the Galilee. And you know, his conclusion, based on the documentation from the Israeli archives, was that there was no rhyme or reason about who was expelled and who was able to stay. And there was a lot of fluidity with the armistice lines. So there were lots of Palestinians who, for example, were expelled across international borders or into different parts of what was known as Arab Palestine at the time, under Jordanian rule. And they were able to effectuate their own individual right of return. They were able to sneak back across the ceasefire lines to go back home. Sometimes they were caught by the Israeli authorities. They didn't have the Israeli identity cards. And in those cases, when they were caught, they were expelled again a second time. But some were able to come back through that process. And then in regards to Chris's question, so yeah, the Peel Commission was a British-only commission that in 1937 first recommended the partition of Palestine. And it actually recommended the compulsory transfer of Palestinians from within a much, much smaller Jewish state that was proposed then than was proposed in 1947. But this is a main difference between the Peel Commission recommendations of 1937 and the UN recommendations of 1947. And this is something that's so important to talk about, because if you have not read the actual majority report of the UN Special Commission on Palestine that recommended the partitioning of Palestine, you're in for a lot of surprises about what they actually recommended. First of all, they said categorically that no one was supposed to be displaced from their homes. Everyone was entitled to remain in their homes, to remain on their land, and to have full equality within whatever state they found themselves. And there was actually a whole lot of freedom for people to choose their residency and choose their citizenship between the two envisioned states. And more than that, it was premised on very, very strong economic cooperation between the Jewish state and the Arab state. So there were supposed to be open borders where communications and transportation and economic links were all to be open. It was very much like a European Union type of situation with the currency union, for example. Actually, the Jewish state was supposed to provide budgetary subvention to the Arab state because it was known that their economy would be stronger right off the bat, and they wanted to equalize it. So there were a lot of things about the partition plan that made it so that it was never actually implemented. You know, the way that Israel was created was not at all how it was supposed to be. I think what you're referring to, Chris, with the 5 years, so that was part of the trusteeship proposal that the Truman administration supported in March 1948. They supported the UN holding Palestine as a trusteeship for 5 years in the hopes that in those 5 years, the Zionist movement and the Palestinian nationalist movement would be able to work out an arrangement between them. But let me stop, because I'll bet Shai can add in like a whole lot of more details. Sorry to put you on the spot, Shai.
Shai, can you unmute?
Did we lose Shai? Okay, well, maybe maybe we can get him later. Okay. Do we want to do some other questions?
Oh, here we go. I was able to unmute myself. For Josh, thanks so much for the shout out. Congratulations on almost being done, and I really can't wait to read this book. I want to ask you a question, and I don't want to cede my time for that. So I'll quickly say something about the 150,000, and then I want you to give some thought to what I wanted to ask you. So I think it's really a combination of factors, but some of it, of course, is Nazareth, that also, there was some international pressure really not to expel the Palestinians there, that was really, really significant. Possibly some small dissent of local commanders in some places that, decided not to put people on buses and things like that. But also towards the end of 1948, Palestinian already have the sense that, if those who were forcibly expelled and put on buses, that's one thing. But we know that about 55% of the villages, people fled, because of Jewish duress, right? Jewish forces came into these villages, started shooting, executing some people, and then people flee. By the end of the war, especially in Operation Yoav in the southern front and Hiram in the north, Palestinians know already that there's a good chance that if they flee, they would not be allowed to return. And so this steadfastness is much, much more significant. But again, we're talking about 750,000 that become refugees out of sorry, I realize my video is not working, but it is now, out of 1.4 million. So this is a very, very, very significant number. All right, so that's on that, but I want to ask you now a quick question. It's fascinating to see, how vast the knowledge of, the Truman administration was about the unfolding of the Nakba. It's really fascinating. I was a little struck by your comparison in the sense with the Biden administration, because in one way, it almost sounds that you're sort of a little bit vindicating the Truman administration. And why I found this surprising is because absolutely there were officials that, rang the alarm bells. By the way, we have that in the Biden administration today, right? Everyone who's going around DC sees all these officials who are saying, yeah, what's going on? It's unbelievable, genocide, et cetera, but we know it doesn't make it to the upper echelons. You seem to suggest that it did make it to those sort of upper echelons of the administration during the Truman administration, and that it wasn't just the sort of ground level, whatever officials that are just sending reports up the chain of command. And I wanted you to, if you can, to say something about that. Do you feel that the administration itself sort of adopted these views and tried to enact policy based on that? Something we can definitely not say about today's Biden administration. So I wanted you, if you can sharpen that comparison between those two administrations that you were alluding to.
Mm-hmm. Great. Should we take a couple more?
Sure. Judith, would you mind unmuting?
First, I have a story, a Truman story for you, and then I have a question that I hope you will feel free to expound on. The Truman story is that the Jews of Cleveland got together, including the rabbi that was, supposed to be my spiritual advisor, but he wasn't, funded the whistle stop tours that Truman then won by. So look to Cleveland for the money for Truman. And that might have something to do with how he actually won. And the question is, in the category of what should we do now, I have been writing to Kamala regularly and saying she needs to support an embargo of arms to Israel. And I've been trying to get my friends to do that too. And And maybe I should stop doing that because it's useless. But tell me what to do instead.
Sure. Okay. Can we take one more?
Yes, we're gonna take Ellie, if you would unmute.
And actually, I was just going to, I noticed that Josh is working with Ilan Pape, and I wanted to mention his latest book because I've been, all of us have been trying to deal with the divisions in really different way of looking at what's going on in the Middle East. And where that comes from. And, he's Ilan Pape has just published really a 2-inch book that I'm looking at, a lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm hoping that it's okay to mention that book because it's so relevant to, and it goes way back into the, the 18th, or, the 1800s. It's a long story, heavily annotated. So that was really the only point I wanted to make, just to alert people to the existence of that brand new book by Ilan Pape.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So in response to Shai's question, and by the way, I would definitely encourage VJP to do a book talk with Shai on Dear Palestine. It's really, really a phenomenal book. This is what I found in the documents that I looked at. Truman was not very interested in the details of the policy. And in most cases, the State Department brought him very well formulated policy positions. And in most cases, he simply noted, I approve on the document. On most things, this doesn't count for the recognition of Israel, which really was a knockdown, drag-out fight within the Truman administration. But on almost everything else, he was in complete lockstep with the State Department. There's a certain historiography out there, which I think is false, that claims that the State Department was pitted against Truman. In most cases of serious policy initiatives, for example, ending U.S. support for partition and supporting trusteeship, Truman approved. Supporting Count Bernadotte's second mediation proposal, which included the return of refugees, was something that Truman personally approved. In fact, Truman approved the State Department sending out an envoy to actually help write the report that Bernadotte wrote. So what Bernadotte proposed to the UN, his report got there right after he was assassinated by Israeli extremists. What Bernadotte proposed, the US helped to write. You could go further and look at the decision to support the UN General Assembly Resolution 194, supporting the right of refugees to return. That was supported by Truman, agreed to by him. It was agreed to by Truman to cut off the Export-Import Bank loans to Israel. It was agreed to by Truman that at least 250,000 Palestinian refugees should be repatriated. So I found evidence of a lot of high-level presidential agreement with what the State Department was pushing. At times it was overruled for sure, but most of the time there was agreement between the two. I've also heard that Truman's whistle-stop tour of 1948 was largely funded by people who were Zionist in orientation. The DNC in 1948 was heavily indebted to a few large Jewish Zionist fundraisers. I didn't hear that specifically the money came from Cleveland, and if you're talking about Rabbi Silver, I doubt he would have raised money for Truman because he was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. So it probably came from elsewhere. Look, it's never a waste of time to be writing to our public officials, to be talking to them, to make demands of them. You know, if we learn anything from the archives and how the Zionist organization in the United States mobilized in 1948, is that persistent pressure and building political strength is necessary to affect policy. So even though it seems futile, please, I want to encourage everyone to keep on doing it, because if we don't, then there's no counter pressure. Okay, do we want to take the last few hands?
Sure. Are you able to go till 9?
Yeah, we were just thinking, since it's so interesting and there's still many hands coming up, we thought we would try to extend this. If you can, stay with us, Josh, another 15 minutes till 9.
Sure.
Let's do that. And if anybody needs to leave, that's fine. Please make it right for you, but everyone is welcome to stay, and we'll try to keep getting through the questions. I think Kate has to leave in just a few minutes. I'll be the co-host and take us all the way up to 9. So let's go with is it Doki Fasian? Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Please.
Hi. Thank you very much. Hi, Josh. It's so good to see
Hey,
you.
Doc.
Oh God, such a great talk. Thank you, Josh. This was really insightful. My big question is about the current Biden administration and how they're flouting the law and breaking the law. And I'm curious what recourse citizens have, civil society has, to hold our lawmakers and policymakers accountable for breaking US law and supplying weapons to Israel that's committing a genocide using US taxpayer dollars. What's being done? What can be done? And do you think it will be done? I mean, what's next actually for Anthony Blinken and others who are writing these reports and just not following the law? Thanks.
Great. You want to take a couple more, Mark?
Yeah, let's take the last two hands. I see Burhan and Jerry and Kathy for a follow-up. Let's take those last three, Josh.
Okay, yes. And yes, well, thank you. I mean, what an exploration this has been. Thank you so much. We've got a lot to work from. One thing that has impressed me about Israel is its willingness to do the dirty work for the U.S. And that is especially true in Latin America with Guatemala, Colombia, I think Argentina, and maybe more. So that brings me to an observation that Michael Hudson has brought forward, and that is that this country does not want to see its soldiers at risk. And after the experience of the Vietnam War with anti-draft activities, that using proxies has become a major practice. And whether it's using Ukraine this way or this extremely opportunistic scoundrel who is rushed into, I don't know if it was a void, but with what's creating this horrible genocide and spreading it even to, ready to do this to other countries. And the theory, as I heard it from Michael Hudson, was that these are targets that the U.S. has designated and that a stepping stone on the way to Russia and China. I mean, to read the plans that are in place and all of these think tanks with these monsters sketching out our future, the world's future. It's just such a, I mean, it reminds me of a slogan I saw that was printed on a Nazi leather belt or something. I mean, that explains why Israel is so perfect for this. Gott mit uns. God with us, and the tie-in with you know. Well, anyway, I'm just I'm fascinated to hear that angle, like squeezing the balloon and it bulges out somewhere else. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. Borhan, why don't you add yours, and then those, Josh, you can do your magic with those three.
I thank you, Josh. This is amazing. I bet you people will stay with you as long as you wanted to stay. But I appreciate you stayed with us to answer more questions. But I wanted to say something personal. I was born in the Tulkarm district. We were on the 67 borders. And I always heard my father and grandfather talking about our relatives who were pushed out of Tira, Kalansawi, and the little triangle. They came to our village and our area. And then after the ceasefire, if you call it ceasefire, they smuggled themselves and went back. So there was people, my grandfather and father, when I was a teenager, they were telling us, oh yeah, this, because my grandfather, his sister lives in Tira, her family came to us, stayed with us, fled and pushed out, and then they went back. So in support of what you're saying, a lot of people tried to return. And I heard the story from my family that there was some people who got killed while trying to go back. But this is a personal story. But I want to, Josh, to get your thoughts on this. Our community is really struggling, and that is even an understatement about Harris, Stein. Nobody talks about Trump, and we are really struggling as a community on this. Where do you see Harris change? Is really possible? I tell people that she's not the president now, and I think she may be taking the current position to secure some votes, and I think she's gonna change if she wins. Where do you see she can change? Does she really have, as a new person coming to the White House, is she going to be like an Obama who talks a lot and then all of a sudden disappears? Or where do you see this? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. Let me start with the historical one. So the little triangle that Borhan was just talking about, that was an area that Israel forced Jordan basically at gunpoint to concede to it as part of the armistice agreements. By the way, Israel also wanted the big triangle, including Tulkarm, and that actual territorial demand was conveyed by the Israeli foreign minister to US diplomats in 1949, that they wanted that too. They didn't get the big triangle, but they got the little triangle. And even though the armistice agreement with Jordan, it allowed for a civilian police force of Palestinians in those villages, and Israeli soldiers were supposed to be out of the little triangle. They weren't even supposed to have a presence there. And there were guarantees that those villagers could stay in their homes. But of course, Israel broke this promise just like it broke many other promises, like keeping civilians in the Fallujah pocket after the Egyptian-Israeli armistice agreement, for example, when all of those villagers were expelled as well. So there were many hundreds of villagers from different little triangle villages who were expelled back across the armistice lines to Jordan. And of course, you're right that many Palestinians did attempt to return on their own. And I found many reports from US diplomats and US people, American people who were in high positions of authority with the UN, monitoring the truce, monitoring the armistice, talking about how Israel had this shoot to kill policy against returning Palestinian refugees. So yeah, this was openly known and talked about by the United States, and it was also extensively documented by the Israeli historian Benny Morris, who talked about the shoot to kill policy against infiltrators. So that's the history part. Moving to the present and Dochi's question, unfortunately, there's actually very little that Americans can do in terms of having legal recourse and holding their officials accountable when they don't follow US law. It was tried. It was tried in a federal district court in San Francisco. Earlier this year, there was a case that was brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights. Excuse me. One second. Apologies, a little sick. Sorry. There was a case that was brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of Palestinian Americans and on behalf of other Palestinians whose family was impacted by Israel's genocidal violence over the last year. In US court, the Center for Constitutional Rights, on behalf of these Palestinians, tried to sue President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin for complicity in genocide. Interestingly enough, the judge not only allowed all of the testimony from all of these Palestinians to be entered into the court record, but the judge found, like the International Court of Justice, that there was a plausible case to be made for Israel committing genocide. However, he threw the case out from court under what's known as the political doctrine theory, which is that the court cannot meddle in political decisions that are supposedly the sole prerogative of the executive branch. So unfortunately, that challenge wasn't successful. Even though we have very limited legal recourse, I think we have a lot of political recourse. I mean, I think what Secretary of State Blinken did in falsifying that report to Congress that Israel was blocking humanitarian aid is an impeachable offense. I mean, he should resign. I mean, obviously the man has no shame and has been an architect of this policy. So he's not going to resign, but he should. But I think that should be an impeachable offense, So I think we can be building pressure on our members of Congress to demand why the Biden administration is falsifying the reports of its experts when it comes to Israel's campaign of starvation against Palestinians. And I think that members of Congress are very concerned about being lied to by this administration. So I think it's in answer to your question, Dochi, I think it's more like political recourse than legal recourse. Yeah, the aversion to soldiers at risk. Look, the United States is engaging in hostilities on behalf of Israel. The recent Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israeli military and intelligence targets last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, the United States admitted that it actively engaged in hostilities by trying to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles from carriers that were based in the Mediterranean. Time and again, President Biden has said, we will fight and defend Israel should it be attacked by Iran. The head of CENTCOM, which is the command of the US military with global responsibilities for the Middle East, Michael Kurilla, recently went to Tel Aviv to coordinate Israel's response in its retaliation against Iran. So the United States is very much caught up in the thick of Israeli military operations. There's been a lot of evidence that's come to light that the United States has been providing intelligence information and sharing to Israel over the course of the last year, helping in some cases with actual targeting, especially when it comes to attacks in Lebanon. So there is a huge danger, I would say, that the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israel's attacks in Gaza, and now its greenest of green lights to attack Lebanon, really open the door to a potential regional, all-out regional war that could definitely involve the United States in very, very active hostilities. And I know that there are some in our political system who are cheerleading right now for exactly that outcome, aka Lindsey Graham, for example. But I don't think this is what the majority of Americans want. I don't think the majority of Americans want to see us embroiled in yet another endless war in the region. I don't think a majority of Americans want to be fighting Israel's wars on its behalf. What I do know from public opinion polling is that a vast majority of all Americans, 3/4, want an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And most Americans want to see an end to weapons to Israel. So, you know, politicians who believe otherwise are flouting the public opinion of their constituents. Harris. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm an aspiring historian, and so it's much easier for me to look back and review the documents and try to make assessment and analysis based on that than try to predict the future. I can't predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. I'll say this about Harris. I don't think that she's a committed ideological Zionist. I think that for her, it's much more of a political calculation in a way that it's not for President Biden. And in that respect, Borhan, I do think that there could be a lot of similarities between a Harris administration policy and Obama administration policy. I think there could be a strong chance that she will be very rhetorically sympathetic to the Palestinian people in a way that Biden's not, while not changing the policy, which was basically the issue with Obama, which is what I wrote about in my first book. But we don't know. We do know that the advisors that are surrounding her are much, much better than the people who are surrounding and advising Biden. So hopefully that would translate into personnel hirings in a Harris administration, and hopefully that would lead to a better policy. But obviously that's all speculation, and we would have to wait and see if she wins the election.
All right. Friends, I have 9 o'clock. Thanks to everyone for staying around. And Josh, what an amazing presentation. Thanks for all the detail.
Thank you.
And let's do our online thing, thanking Josh for his presentation. It was great. It was great.
Thank you very much.
We do want people to know that we have recorded this, and if you would like a copy of the recording, please write to Voices for Justice in Palestine. Kate will be keeping track of all those requests and sending you the link. So this concludes our webinar, and with special thanks to Josh fighting a cold and being very present to us with all these questions. Thank you again, Josh. It was great. So all the best. Continue your work on behalf of a free Palestine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming.
Burhan, stay on for a second as everyone clears off. I just want to ask you a few questions. Thanks to everyone again. Burhan, have you got some time tomorrow and we can call and maybe also check in with Kate?
Are you?
You're still muted, Burhan. Burhan, can you unmute? I'm not hearing you.
Okay, to unmute. That's a
She's
new-
already left.
Okay, he thinks you're hearing everything you say.
No.
Send him a text.
Burhan, can you hear me? You're still muted. You're talking, but I can't hear
Put
you.
your hand to your ear like this.
Yeah.
Do it again.
You know, I think maybe if she had me as a co-host, I have to unmute him. I don't know how to do that with she didn't give me the full screen, so
You're gonna have to send a text message or a chat.
there we go. Burhan, I see you, but if you can't unmute, I think it's because Kate had it so that everyone was staying, and I don't see where she's given me the capacity to change everything.
Tell him to send a text.
Let me just call you. I'll call you.
Okay.
Yeah.